At the age of 89, Anthony Hopkins is not only an actor, he is a living icon of world cinema, a man who has redefined the art of acting with his depth and chilling precision. He won 2 Oscars for Best Actor, the first with his iconic role in The Silence of the Lambs, where, with only a few minutes of screen time, he created one of the most haunting characters in film history, and the second in his 80s with The Father, becoming the oldest person ever to win the category, a testament to the enduring power of talent that time cannot erode. In addition, he also possesses a long list of other prestigious awards, such as BAFTA, Emmy, Golden Globe, along with the knighthood bestowed by the Queen of England, affirming his irreplaceable position in both British cinema and Hollywood. His roles have spanned many decades, from historical figures and powerful men to broken souls, all bearing his unique imprint, making audiences not only watch but feel every breath of the character. And with more than half a century of dedication, he has not only built a career, he has built a legacy that very few can reach. But behind all that glory is an untold story, a void that no award can fill. Because Anthony Hopkins has not only fought the world, he has had to fight himself in a silent battle that lasted for many years, from the days of sinking into alcoholism to the point of losing control, waking up not remembering who he was or what he had done, to the decision to give it all up in silence without needing any witnesses, a journey of self-rescue without applause. He has achieved everything a person could dream of, but he could not hold on to the simplest things. His relationship with his daughter gradually became distant to the point of almost disappearing, leaving an invisible wound that is never healed, and perhaps that is the greatest paradox in his life, that the man who can understand and express every nuance of human emotion has to live with the distances he himself cannot bridge. But even carrying those losses, he still continues to move forward, still continues to work, still continues to exist, not as a perfect person, but as a human being who has learned to live with what cannot be changed. If Anthony Hopkins' story has just touched you, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a quiet way to acknowledge a man who has brought his entire life to the screen but kept the pain for himself. After everything he has become, after the stage lights and the seemingly endless applause, few know that Anthony Hopkins' story did not begin with glory, but began from a much colder place, a childhood where no one really listened. No one was patient enough to understand, and no one was there to tell him that he had value. In Port Talbot, Wales, in an ordinary working-class family, life had no loud tragedies, but it was full of silent voids, where love was not spoken and care was never clearly shown, where a child grew up, not with words of encouragement, but with the feeling that he had to find his own way alone, even when he still did not understand how this world worked. From very early on, he realized he was different, not in a special way, but in a way that made others uncomfortable. Because he had dyslexia, something that at that time was not properly understood, not sympathized with, but considered a sign of slowness, of inferiority, of a child who was not smart enough, and so from one class to another, he sat there, watching the letters dance in front of his eyes without being able to grasp them, listening to teachers lecture without being able to keep up, watching other children answer questions easily while he was left behind. Not because he did not try, but because no one taught him in a way he could understand. Every day at school was not an opportunity to learn, but a repeated experience of shame, of being called on and standing silent, of uncomfortable looks from teachers, of giggles from friends, and gradually, something began to form inside him, not rebellion, but the belief that maybe they were right. Maybe he really was not good enough. Maybe he was born wrong. He had no close friends, no place to escape that feeling, no one to share the thoughts that even he could not put into words, and so he learned to be silent, learned to observe from afar, learned to exist without needing attention, because attention only brought more hurt. There were afternoons when he wandered alone, not because he liked it, but because there was nowhere else to go. There were nights when he lay there, staring at the ceiling, not understanding why everything was so difficult for him, not understanding why things that were simple for others became an insurmountable wall for him, and no one was there to answer. Gradually, the feeling of being left behind was no longer a temporary experience, but became part of who he was. A small but persistent voice in his head reminding him that he was not smart enough, not fast enough, not good enough, that he would never catch up with this world, and the scariest thing was not what others said, but that he began to believe it. In a world where a person's value is measured by the ability to learn, by achievements, by recognition, Anthony Hopkins grew up without any of those things, only with silence, with loneliness, and a vague but increasingly clear feeling that he did not belong here, that he was standing outside the life that everyone else was living. And it was from that dark place, from a childhood without encouragement, without understanding, without a helping hand at the right time, that a child began to grow up with a deep belief that he had no value, a belief that would follow him for many years afterward, creeping into every decision, every relationship, every silent moment that no one saw, and becoming the first, deepest wound that he would carry to the end of his life. And then, when a child grows up with the belief that he has no value, he will do one of two things: either accept disappearing or find somewhere to become someone else. And for Anthony Hopkins, acting did not begin as a dream, but as an escape, the only door that opened out of the feeling of being trapped inside his own self. He did not enter the art with confidence or burning passion, as many still imagine. He stepped into it like a man running away from the classrooms where he was always the slowest, from the judging eyes, from the small voice in his head that kept repeating that he was not good enough. And when he first stood on stage, what he felt was not joy, but a strange relief, because there he did not need to be himself, did not need to be the boy with dyslexia, did not need to be the one always left behind. He could become anyone else, and in that moment, he no longer felt that he was broken. But running away is never healing, and when he was accepted into prestigious training environments like the Drama Academy, where the most outstanding talents gathered, the old fear did not disappear. It only changed shape, became more subtle, more silent, and more painful. Because now, instead of being seen as inferior, he began to feel like an imposter, a person who had accidentally stepped into a place that did not belong to him. Around him were confident students, people who understood the texts clearly, understood the techniques, people who seemed born to stand on stage, while he still had to struggle with the letters, still had to try twice as hard just to keep up, and every time he saw others progress faster, a part of him quietly shrank, wondering what he was doing there, wondering if it was all just a mistake. Even when he began to have opportunities to work with big names, the real legends of stage and film, that feeling did not lessen. But on the contrary, it became even clearer. Because standing next to people the whole world admired, he did not feel lucky. He only felt small, like someone trying to hold on to a position he did not deserve. There were moments when he stood backstage, looking into the stage lights, his heart beating fast, not from excitement, but from fear. Fear that one day everyone would realize he was not who they thought, that he was only playing the role of an actor, that behind it all was just a child once called a failure. And the irony was that the harder he tried to prove himself, the more he felt he was not enough, because each small success did not bring confidence but only brought a new worry, whether he could repeat it or not, whether this time was the last time people trusted him. His life in those years was not a journey of moving forward, but a series of continuous runs, running from the past, running from the feeling of inferiority, running from himself, and no matter how far he ran, he still carried the same fear, the same void, the same question that never had an answer, whether there would be a day when he could stand still and feel that he was enough or not, or whether this whole life would only be a long journey of becoming someone else, just to forget the real person he had never learned to accept. And then, when running away from himself was no longer enough to keep him standing firm, reality began to appear clearer than ever, cold and unrelenting. When Anthony Hopkins stepped into the early years of his career with the fragile hope that acting could become the place he belonged, but instead of being recognized, he fell into a terrifying void worse than failure, that was invisibility. He worked, he studied. He appeared in small roles, supporting roles no one remembered the name of, characters who passed through the screen without leaving a trace, as if he was only part of the background rather than the center of the story. And in a world where the light always shone on the brightest stars, he stood at the edge, where the light faded, where no one looked long enough to notice he was there. There were no dramatic rejections, no doors slammed in his face, only prolonged silence, a form of failure that was more subtle and cruel. Because at least when rejected, people knew they had been seen. But here, he was not even given that. Day after day, he watched those around him, familiar faces from class, from the stage, from auditions, one by one, begin to get attention, get opportunities, get called, while he remained there, standing still, as if time did not move for him at the same speed as the world. There were evenings when he sat alone, remembering the years he had spent, the efforts he had poured into each role, and wondering if anyone besides himself noticed all of that or not, or if it was all just fading into a void without leaving a trace. The pain did not come from not succeeding, but from not being seen, from not being recognized, from the feeling that whether he existed or not, the world would not change. And gradually that thought began to sink in. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently, making him wonder if he really had nothing special, that perhaps all the doubts from childhood were right, that he was not someone the world would remember. He continued to work, continued to take small roles, continued to appear and then disappear on screen. And each time like that, a part of him faded a little more, as if he himself was gradually dissolving into those nameless roles. There were times when he stood in the middle of a film set, surrounded by lights, cameras, laughter, but felt more alone than ever, because even though he was at the center of a collective activity, he still did not really belong there. No one really waited for his presence. No one felt his absence when he left. The silence of failure stretched on until it became part of life, no longer shocking, no longer making him resist, but only quietly shaping the way he saw himself, making him gradually accept that perhaps he would only be a small name in the long list of people who had tried but never really touched anything. And in the rare moments when he dared to imagine the future, the image that appeared was not stage lights or awards, but a gentle disappearance, a life that passed without leaving a mark, without anyone mentioning it, without anyone remembering it, as if he had never existed. The scariest thing was not failing to achieve dreams, but beginning to believe that he did not deserve any dreams at all. And Anthony Hopkins, in those years, not only faced a world that did not see him, but also faced himself, a person who was gradually believing that this invisibility was all he would have in this life. And when a person begins to believe that he is invisible, that he is not good enough, that every effort falls into a void no one sees, they will find some way to soothe that pain. And, for Anthony Hopkins, that way was not the stage lights, not success, but something much simpler and far more dangerous: alcohol. At first, it was just a small glass after work, a way to ease the tension, to temporarily forget a day when he again felt he stood outside life. But then, one glass became two, two became more, and gradually, alcohol was no longer a choice. It became the only refuge, the only place he could step into without having to be himself. In drunkenness, the voices in his head fell silent. The memories of failed classes, forgotten roles, the indifferent looks of others, all blurred, and for a short time he felt lighter, as if the burden had been lifted from his shoulders, as if he no longer had to prove anything to anyone. But the price of that relief was a price he had not yet realized. Because alcohol does not heal, it only delays. It does not erase the pain. It only pushes it deeper, where, when it returns, it will be stronger, heavier, and harder to face. And so the cycle began. He drank to forget the feeling of not being good enough. But every morning when he woke up, that feeling came back, even clearer, sharper, and to cope with it, he turned to alcohol again, like a person trying to put out a fire by pouring more oil. There were nights when he drank to the point of not remembering what he had said, what he had done, only knowing that when he woke up, there was a gap in his memory, a gap that frightened him but was not enough to make him stop, because stopping meant having to face it, and facing it was what he feared most. In those years, his life began to slide quietly, with no big events, no dramatic falls, only small changes that accumulated. Relationships began to crack, conversations became shorter, looks became more distant, and in the family, silence began to spread like a heavy atmosphere that no one knew how to name. People no longer asked if he was okay, because the answer was always the same, and he no longer tried to explain, because he did not know where to start, did not know how to say that he was sinking without anyone seeing, that every day that passed was a battle between continuing and letting go. The people closest to him began to sense the change, but the distance between them grew larger, not because they did not care, but because he did not give them the chance to step in, because letting someone in meant showing them the truth. And the truth was what he had spent his whole life avoiding. Gradually, family was no longer a place he returned to, but became a space where he felt lost, where conversations became awkward, where his presence did not bring warmth, but only left a puzzling void. And so, little by little, without noise, without announcement, the connecting threads began to break. The scariest thing was not losing the family, but losing it without realizing, losing it without a clear moment to say, this is when everything changed, because everything changed slowly, day by day, week by week, year by year, until one day he looked back and realized that what used to be the center of his life now was only distant memories. Meanwhile, his career continued. He still worked, still appeared, still played roles, but it all happened as if two people existed in parallel, one on screen, in control, precise, full of emotion, and one in real life, lost, tired, and increasingly distant from himself. Alcohol had done what he initially wanted. It helped him not have to face the feeling of not being good enough, but in return, it took away the ability to feel anything else. Joy, connection, presence, all gradually became blurred, and he began to live like a shadow of himself, existing but not really living. And in that silence, in the unseen vortex of self-destruction, Anthony Hopkins not only gradually lost those around him, but also gradually lost the person he once hoped to become. A loss that was not loud, not dramatic, but profound enough to change everything, even the way he looked at himself when standing in front of the mirror. And then there was one morning, with no warning signs, no loud noise, no dramatic event that people could point to and say, that was when everything collapsed. But for Anthony Hopkins, that was exactly the day when darkness swallowed everything left in him. He woke up, opened his eyes, looked up at the ceiling, and in the first few seconds, everything seemed normal. A morning just like any other morning. But then, a strange feeling began to creep in. A void, a break that he could not name, and when he tried to remember the day before, remember where he had been, what he had done, who he had talked to, nothing appeared, only an empty black screen, a cold void where memories should have existed. He tried harder, closed his eyes, concentrated, as if by trying hard enough the images would come back. But there was nothing, not a single detail, not a single sound, not a single face, as if a part of his life had been erased without leaving a trace. And in that moment, fear did not come like a storm, but came slowly, heavily, pressing down on every thought, every breath, because he realized that this was not an ordinary forgetfulness, not fatigue, but something deeper, more dangerous, a sign that he was losing himself. He sat up, looked around the room. Everything was still there, furniture, light, familiar details, but all of it felt foreign, as if he was in someone else's life, as if the person who had lived through the previous day was no longer him. And that thought, when it formed clearly, carried a horror that did not need blood or accidents to become real, because nothing was more terrifying than realizing that he was turning into a person he himself did not recognize, that his actions, words, choices were drifting away without control, without memory, without responsibility, as if he was living but not really present. In that moment, everything became clear in a cool way. All those glasses of alcohol, all those times of avoidance, all those nights he chose not to face the pain, all of it had led here to a morning where he was no longer sure who he was. And the most painful thing was not that he had gone too far, but that he knew if he continued, there would be no way back. No one was there to tell him what to do. No hand was placed on his shoulder, no voice guided him, only him and the raw truth before his eyes, that the path he was on would not end in healing or success, but in disappearance, not disappearing from the world, but disappearing from himself. He thought about everything that had happened, the years of trying, the roles, the rare moments when he felt he could become someone, and then compared it with the man sitting here, lost in his own memories, and for the first time in a very long time, he no longer looked for a way to run away, because there was nowhere left to run, no other version to become, no role that could hide this truth. It was not a loud fall, but a complete collapse from within, a breaking that no one saw but was enough to end everything if he allowed it to continue. And in that silence, in the room with no witnesses, Anthony Hopkins faced the only choice left. Not between success and failure, not between fame and oblivion, but between continuing to exist as an empty shadow or stopping, looking straight at the pain he had spent his whole life avoiding and trying to rebuild himself from what remained. That was the moment when everything seemed to darken, not because the light disappeared, but because he finally saw clearly the path he was on and realized that if he did not change, he would not die in the way people usually think, but would gradually fade, day by day, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to call Anthony Hopkins anymore. And in the moment when everything seemed to have slipped out of control, when the darkness was no longer a vague feeling but became a frighteningly clear reality, Anthony Hopkins stood before a choice that no one else could make for him. No hero appeared. No hand pulled him back. No miracle happened. Only one man sitting alone with the truth that if he did not stop right then, he would lose everything. Not in the loud way the world could notice, but in the most silent way, disappearing from within before anyone could see. And so, with no announcement, no solemn promise, no witnesses, he decided to quit alcohol. Not like a brave action to be praised, but like the final survival instinct of a man who had reached his limit, a simple decision that carried the weight of an entire life. Because he understood that from that moment onward, he would have to face everything he had avoided, every memory, every fear, every feeling of not being good enough that had been buried under the influence of alcohol for many years. The first days had no light of victory, no feeling of liberation, only emptiness and pain. A void that alcohol had previously filled, now fully exposed, forcing him to sit with himself without any protection. And that was the hardest part, because facing the world had never been as frightening as facing himself when there was nothing left to hide. There were nights when he lay awake, not because he could not sleep, but because he did not want to close his eyes. Because every time he closed his eyes, the thoughts came rushing back. Old memories surfaced clearer than ever. The failures, the times he was left behind, the moments when he felt he did not belong anywhere, all returned, not blurred by alcohol, not distorted, but intact, sharp, and painful. His body also reacted, trembling, tense, as if resisting his own decision, as if every cell in him had become used to relying on alcohol to exist, and now had to relearn how to live from the beginning. A process with no shortcuts, no immediate rewards, only persistence, hour by hour, day by day, moment by moment. No one saw that battle, no audience, no applause, no one standing beside him saying he was doing well, because most of the time even he was not sure he was doing the right thing, not sure where this would lead, only knowing that going back to the old path meant accepting disappearance. There were days when he felt he was moving forward, felt his mind clearer, felt he could control himself. But then there were days when everything became blurry again, when the craving for alcohol returned, when negative thoughts became stronger, when the voice in his head whispered again that all of this was meaningless, that he would never change, that he was still the man who once woke up not remembering who he was. And in those moments, the only thing that kept him going was not grand belief or bright hope, but a small repeated decision. Not drinking today, just today, and tomorrow would be handled later. A way of existing day by day, step by step. Like a man relearning how to walk after forgetting the feeling of standing firm. Gradually, very slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. Not on the outside, but inside. A different kind of stillness. No longer the frightening emptiness, but a space that he could begin to fill with his real presence. A feeling he had not experienced for a very long time. The feeling of being himself without needing to escape. But even when those signs appeared, the battle was not over. Because quitting alcohol did not mean erasing the pain. It only opened the door for the pain to be seen more clearly, and he had to learn to live with it, not avoid it, not numb it, but accept it as part of who he was. It was a process with no clear ending, no moment when he could say he had won, because every day was still a choice, every day was still a challenge, and just one moment of letting go could bring it all back. But it was precisely in that quiet repetition, in the days no one saw, no one recorded, that Anthony Hopkins did what few could do. He saved himself, not with loud strength or heroic actions, but with quiet persistence, by facing what he had feared most, and from there, little by little, rebuilding a new person from the ruins of himself. A person who was not perfect, not without scars, but a person who had chosen to stay, who had chosen not to disappear, even when everything inside him once wanted to let go. When that silent battle gradually stabilized, when each day passed without being swallowed by the craving for alcohol, something that seemed to have come too late began to appear in Anthony Hopkins' life. That was recognition, the first looks that truly stopped on him instead of gliding past, the roles that began to have weight, depth, and reputation. But the paradox was that when success finally knocked on the door, the man who stood up to open it was no longer like the person who once dreamed of it, because the years of struggling with the feeling of not being good enough, with invisibility, with self-destruction, had taken away the innocence in him, had worn down the part of the person who once desperately wanted to be seen, leaving a more cautious, more controlled, and more distant version of himself with his own emotions. He stepped into new opportunities, not with the excitement of someone being given the light for the first time, but with the wariness of a man who had grown used to darkness, always preparing for the possibility that it could all disappear at any time, that this recognition was only temporary, that he could still be left behind like before, The praises, the positive reviews, the bigger opportunities began to appear, but instead of bringing complete joy, they came with a feeling that was hard to name, as if he was arriving late in his own life, as if the younger version of him was the one who should have experienced these moments, not the man who had gone through so much loss and self-doubt. There were times when he stood on stage or sat in the makeup room, looked in the mirror and saw a successful man, but deep inside he was still the child who had been left behind in class, still the young man who once believed he was not good enough, and the gap between those two images created a void that no achievement could fill. The feeling, "I should have been this person a long time ago," was not a passing thought, but a smoldering regret, creeping into every moment that should have been happy, making joy never complete. Because each victory carried the shadow of the years that had been lost, the opportunities that had passed, the versions of himself that he never had the chance to become. Success came, but it did not bring liberation. It only changed the form of the struggle, from trying to be seen to trying to believe he deserved what he had. He worked more, focused more, disciplined more, not to achieve more, but to hold on to what he had already achieved, like a man who always feared that everything could collapse if he let his guard down even a little. Control became a new layer of armor, helping him stay away from old mistakes, but at the same time keeping him at a distance from real emotions, making it hard for him to relax, hard for him to fully enjoy the moments he had once dreamed of. Outsiders looking in saw a career gradually blooming, saw an actor increasingly recognized, but they did not see the invisible price that came with it, which was that he no longer knew how to feel joy simply, no longer knew how to believe he deserved it without proving it, no longer knew how to live in the present without being haunted by the past. Each step forward was calculated. Each opportunity was approached with caution, as if he was walking on a thin rope, always keeping balance so as not to fall back to where he had once been. There were rare moments, very brief, when he allowed himself to feel a bit of pride, a bit of satisfaction. But right after that, a familiar voice would appear, reminding him not to trust this too much, that everything could change, that he had once been at the bottom, and there was no guarantee he would not return there. Therefore, Anthony Hopkins' success in this period was not a brilliant peak, but a silent uphill climb, where each step carried the memory of previous slips, where the light did not completely dispel the darkness but only created clearer contrasting areas. He had achieved what once seemed impossible, but the price of arriving late was that he could not experience it like a person who had never been hurt, could not embrace it with completeness, could not go back to give the younger version of himself what it had needed most, and therefore, even in success, there still existed a quiet sadness, a feeling that no matter how far he had come, there was still some part of life that he would never get back. And then, after all those years of moving forward in silence, after the cautious steps and the successes that were never complete, the moment when the world could finally no longer turn its back on Anthony Hopkins arrived, without loud announcement, without needing long build-up, but exploding in a short-lived role that was enough to change everything, when he stepped into the world of the Silence of the Lambs and became a character whose mere appearance made the space seem to freeze. Hannibal Lecter was not an ordinary role. It was a phenomenon, a figure that audiences could not take their eyes off, a presence both quiet and terrifying, without needing to shout, without needing much action, just a look, a slight smile, a well-timed pause, all carrying an energy that made viewers feel seen through, touched in the deepest parts they did not want anyone to see. What made this role different was not just technique, but the feeling that he was not acting, but understanding. Understanding to a frightening degree. Understanding to the point that made people wonder where he took it from, because to portray a man like Hannibal Lecter, it required not only talent, but also an approach to darkness that not everyone dared to face. And it was at that point that the question began to form, not from the press or the audience, but from those who had followed his journey. That a man who had once lived in loneliness, who had once run from himself, who had once faced emptiness and long periods of darkness, whether he had brought those things into the role, whether those years had given him the ability to reach layers that others could only imagine. When the film was released, the world reacted not only with praise, but with obsession. Because Hannibal Lecter was not like ordinary villains, he was not loud, not chaotic, but controlled, calm, almost elegant. And it was that contrast that created the greatest fear, because it made people realize that darkness did not always show itself. Sometimes it hid under a perfect appearance, sometimes it existed in silence. The Oscar came as undeniable recognition, as a milestone that no one could deny. But for Anthony Hopkins, it was not a moment of complete liberation, because even though the world finally saw him, he still carried inside everything that had shaped who he was: the memories, the fears, the voids that had never really been filled. The brilliant success of this role did not erase the past, but on the contrary, it acted like a mirror, making clearer what had always existed. Because every time he looked back at Hannibal Lecter, he did not just see a character, but saw a part of himself, not in the actions, but in the understanding, in the ability to observe, in standing outside and looking into people with a distance large enough not to be drawn in, but close enough to feel every detail. There were times when the boundary between the role and the real person became blurred, not because he lost control, but because he understood too clearly, and that understanding came with a price, which was the inability to return to a state of innocence, the inability to look at the world without seeing deeper layers, more hidden motives. Audiences looked at him and saw a legend, a rare talent, a man who could master every shade of emotion, but few realized that this variability was also a burden, because to understand people at that level, he had to go to places many avoided, had to face parts that others chose not to look at. Hannibal Lecter brought him to the peak, but at the same time it stamped something on his image, a connection to darkness that he could not completely separate from, and from then on, every role, every look, every silence carried the echo of that character, like a reminder that his greatest success was also the place that most clearly reflected the person he had become. In the brilliant light of recognition, there still existed a region of darkness that only he understood, a region that no award could touch, a region formed from all the years he had lived, had endured, had tried, and had not been able to change. And perhaps that was exactly what made Anthony Hopkins not only a great actor, but a human being who carried both light and darkness, both glory in the parts that the world could only sense but never truly see. But when the brightest lights shone on him, when the name Anthony Hopkins echoed around the world as a symbol of talent and absolute control, there was another place in his life that gradually darkened, without noise, without explosive moments, only a slow but irreversible withdrawal, where family, where it should have been the final support, instead became a distance that he did not know how to close. While audiences looked at him and saw a man who could understand every nuance of emotion, who could touch the deepest parts of humanity in real life, the closest connections began to fade, especially the relationship with his daughter, a relationship that did not break in one specific moment, but faded over time, through missed calls, through absences, through long silences that no one knew how to fill. At first it might have been just shorter conversations, fewer meetings, promises postponed because of work, because of schedules, because of responsibilities he could not refuse. But over the years, those small things accumulated, turning into a distance so large that no one could remember exactly where it started, and that was what made it the most painful, because there was no clear moment to repair, no starting point to go back to. Some relationships end with arguments, with words, with clear breakdowns, but there are also relationships that end in silence, with both sides gradually getting used to not having each other. and the relationship between him and his daughter seemed to fall into the second type, where there was no door slamming, only a door slowly closing without anyone noticing until it was too late. He still existed in the role of a father, on paper, in memories, in what once was, but that presence was no longer in daily moments, no longer in calls, in meetings, in small sharings that truly make a relationship. A father can exist in name, but not be present in his child's life, and that distance is not always spoken, not always acknowledged, but it is there, clear and persistent. There may have been times when he realized this, brief moments when he paused in the middle of a busy schedule, in the middle of projects, in the middle of praises, and felt something missing, a void that no role could fill. But then life continued. Work swept him away, and those thoughts were pushed aside, like so many other things in his life that had been postponed. Time passed without stopping, and with it, the distance became more fixed, harder to change, until it was no longer a distance that could be crossed, but a reality to accept. The most painful thing was not the inability to go back, but the realization that there may have been times when things could still have been different. Moments when just one different choice, one different presence, one different word, everything could have gone another way. But those moments had passed, could not be retrieved, could not be repaired. In the eyes of the world, he was a successful man, a symbol, a person who had achieved what very few could achieve, but in private space, where there were no cameras, no audience, there existed another truth. A truth not talked about much, that he had not held on to an important part of his life, not because he did not care, but because he did not know how to keep it, did not know how to be present in the way others needed. And that was a special kind of loss, not loud, not clear, with no beginning day or ending day, only a lingering feeling, a quiet awareness that something had left and would not come back. Perhaps he had learned to live with that. Learned to continue, to work, to exist without letting it completely break him. But learning to live with a loss does not mean it disappears. It only becomes part of who he is, a part that he carries in the silences, in the moments no one sees, in the times when even a man who can understand every emotion like him cannot find words to describe. And perhaps that is the greatest paradox in Anthony Hopkins' life, that the man who can make the whole world feel deeply the stories on screen has to live with a story of his own that he has no way to tell completely. A story about a father who was there, but not really there. A story about a relationship that was not destroyed by a big event, but worn down by time and distance, leaving a wound that does not bleed, but never truly heals. After all those silent losses, a paradox became even clearer in Anthony Hopkins' life. A paradox that, if looked at from the outside, was almost impossible to explain, because on screen, he is a master of emotion. A person who can step into the most subtle states of humanity, from deep fear, inner turmoil, to the most fragile moments of love and hurt. He does not just act, he seems to feel for the character, live for them, making audiences not only watch, but feel as if they themselves are in it. But when the lights go out, when the camera stops, that person returns to a different reality, where the simplest connections become so difficult that they are almost impossible to maintain, where everyday conversations without scripts, without directions, without characters to embody, become a challenge he has never truly mastered. What makes everything painful is not that he has no one around, because he has never really been alone in the physical sense. He has always been in spaces with people, with colleagues, with family, with relationships. But the loneliness he carries comes from another place, a deeper place, where no matter how many people stand close, he still cannot reach them, cannot cross the invisible distance between understanding and connection. Acting, throughout his life, has not only been a profession, but the only place where he can exist fully, where he understands what he is doing. understands what he must say, must feel, must react how, where everything has structure, meaning, clear purpose, and it is in that space that he finds a form of freedom he has never had in real life. But real life has no script, no director, no pre-prepared moments, and that is exactly what makes him lost, because there is nothing to hold on to, nothing to interpret, only raw emotions, unshaped, uncontrolled, and sometimes not understood. There are times when he can stand in front of the camera, transform into a completely different person, convey emotions so complex that they make viewers choke up. But when facing a simple conversation in real life, he does not know where to begin, does not know what to say, does not know how to be present in the way others need. That is not because he has no emotions, but because he does not know how to bring those emotions out naturally, does not know how to turn his deep understanding into real connection. The gap between understanding and reaching becomes a boundary he cannot cross, and over time, that boundary becomes fixed, like part of who he is, a part he cannot change no matter how hard he tries. There may have been moments when he realized this, times when he stood in a room full of people, but still felt he was outside. Times when he looked at the relationships around him and realized that he was not really in them, only physically present, but not emotionally connected. That loneliness is not loud, does not demand attention, but it is persistent, silent, following him through every year, every stage of life, creeping into the silences no one sees. What makes it harder to bear is that he knows what connection should feel like. He has portrayed it on screen, has understood it at a level few can reach, but in real life he cannot keep it for himself. That is a special kind of loss. Not losing something specific, but never truly having what he understands most clearly. And so, acting became the place where he lived truly, where he was the fullest version of himself. While life, paradoxically, became the place where he had to continue searching, continue trying, but never really reaching what he had spent his whole life understanding. A journey with no clear ending, where each step carries a question that has never had an answer, whether there will be a day when he can connect with the world out there, in the way he has connected with millions of audiences or not, or whether that will always be the distance he has to learn to live with, like an inseparable part of himself. And then, over time, after those years, when the stage lights were both a place of salvation and a reflection of the deepest darkness, Anthony Hopkins' life gradually slowed down, not because he lost his value, but because he began to choose a different pace, less noisy, less caught up in the vortex of recognition, a life where he no longer had to prove anything to the world every day. Beside his current wife, Stella, he found a form of peace that he had not truly understood before. Not excitement, not a feeling of victory, but stability. The presence of someone who did not love him for the roles, who was not drawn to fame but accepted him as a whole, both the bright parts and the parts he once tried to hide. In that space, he began to live more slowly, spending time on simpler things, painting, playing music, recording small moments that in the past might have been overlooked amid a dense schedule and invisible pressures. The Hollywood lights were still there, the invitations, the projects, the roles, but he no longer chased them with the same urgency as before, as if he had finally allowed himself to stop, to look back, and to breathe. But this peace, no matter how genuine, did not have the power to erase what had happened, because the past is not something that can be set down and forgotten. It is a part of who he is, existing in the silences, in sudden thoughts, in the moments when he is no longer distracted by work or the noise around him. There were quiet afternoons when everything seemed perfect, when nothing demanded anything, nothing created pressure. And it was precisely in those moments that old memories could return clearer than ever, not to hurt him in a fierce way, but in a quiet way, reminding him that there were things lost that could not be retrieved, relationships that had gone so far there was no way back, versions of himself that he would never meet again. This truth did not come as a shock, because he had lived long enough to understand that not everything could be repaired. But understanding did not make it easier to accept. It only made it clearer, more real, and sometimes heavier. He may have found balance, may have built a life where he felt safer, but that did not mean the old wounds had healed. Because healing does not always happen just because time passes. Sometimes time only teaches people how to live with what has never truly been resolved. There were things that no longer hurt him in the way they once did, but they were still there, like marks that could not be erased, like questions without answers, like voids that he had learned not to look at for too long. Peace, in his case, was not the absence of pain, but the ability to exist beside it without being swallowed by it. It was accepting that he could continue living without needing to be perfect, without needing to repair everything, without needing to become a different version of himself. That required a different kind of courage. Not the courage to face the world, but the courage to face what was inside himself, what no one saw, what could not be changed. In this calmer life, Anthony Hopkins did not become a completely new person. He remained himself, with everything that had made him, with both the parts he was proud of and the parts he might wish had been different. And perhaps it was there, in that imperfect acceptance, that he found a form of real peace. Not liberation from the past, but the ability to move forward without letting the past define his entire being. But even when he slowed down, when he chose a less noisy life, the truth remained unchanged, that there were things that could not be retrieved, distances that could not be closed, and stories that would never have a complete ending, only things that could be carried, like an inseparable part of the journey he had traveled. As life gradually settled down and the external noise no longer occupied every moment, another fear began to become clearer in Anthony Hopkins' mind. Not intense, not sudden, but quiet and persistent, the way time always works. The fear of memory, of the possibility that one day what he had lived, experienced, and built might begin to fade, not in the outside world, but in his own mind. Old age does not only bring the slowing of the body, but also brings questions that before he could postpone, but now could not avoid. Questions about what would happen when memory was no longer reliable, when details that were once clear became vague, when familiar faces began to lose their recognition. And in that context, his role in The Father was no longer simply a work of art, but became a deeply personal experience, like a mirror reflecting a possibility he could not ignore, a future he might have to face. In that film, he played a man who gradually lost the ability to recognize the world around him, not knowing where he was, not knowing who the person in front of him was, not sure what was real and what only existed in his mind. And what made this role different was not just technique, but the feeling that he was not only imagining but touching a very real fear, a fear that every human being stepping into old age must face at some level. When the camera stopped, when the lights went out, the emotions from the role did not completely leave, because they evoked thoughts he could not ignore, that if one day he also began to forget, not forget a small detail, but forget himself, forget what had defined him, forget the people he had once known, then what would remain of everything he had built? There was a profound paradox in that a man who had spent his whole life studying, portraying, and understanding people at the deepest level had to face the possibility of losing that very understanding, not because of lack of effort, but because of the limits of the body, of time, of things no one could control. This fear was not loud, did not disrupt daily life, but it was there in quiet moments, in times when he paused during an ordinary day and wondered whether he still remembered everything that had passed, whether any details had begun to blur without him noticing, whether parts of himself had changed that he could not name. The scariest thing was not death, because death is a clear ending, a boundary that people can understand. But the slow disappearance, little by little, when memory no longer holds its shape, when the self is no longer a stable entity but becomes a series of pieces that are no longer connected. For Anthony Hopkins, who had lived his whole life holding on to every detail, every emotion, every nuance to bring to the screen, the thought that one day he might no longer hold on to those things was not only a personal fear, but also a challenge to the very nature of who he was. But just like many other things in his life, he did not choose to run from this fear. He faced it, not with drama, but with awareness, with acceptance that there are things beyond control. That understanding people does not mean being able to keep that understanding forever. That memory, like everything else, can change, can fade. In that confrontation, there was a different kind of courage. Not the courage to fight, but the courage to accept that he might no longer be the person he once was, to accept that a person's value lies not only in what they remember, but also in what they have lived, created, left behind. And even though the fear was still there, even though there was no certain answer, Anthony Hopkins continued to move forward, not because he was not afraid, but because he understood that fear is also part of the journey, a part that he, like anyone else, had to learn to carry without letting it define his entire being, but also without denying its existence, as a reminder that even those who understand people the most are not outside their own limits. And as the fears about memory gradually became part of reality, when time was no longer a distant concept, but present in every day, every moment, another truth also became clearer than ever in Anthony Hopkins' life. A truth that no award could cover, no role could soothe, that not every wound is healed. Not everything lost can be found again, and not every story, no matter how great, has a perfect ending. Throughout his long journey, he had overcome so many things, had won battles that many never saw, had built a career that few could reach. But alongside that, there still existed voids that could not be filled, relationships that could not be mended, moments that had passed and would never return. There is a tendency in the way the world looks at people like him, a desire to believe that in the end everything is resolved, that after all they will find healing, will repair mistakes, will reconnect with those who have drifted away, as if that is the deserved reward for what they have been through. But reality does not always work that way, and Anthony Hopkins' life is proof of this. There are relationships that do not break because of a big event, but because of the accumulation of small, unresolved things, distances not closed, absences no one noticed at the time. And when looking back, there is no specific point to return to, no moment to repair, only a distance that has become part of reality. Accepting that is not an act of weakness, but a different kind of courage. The courage to look straight at the truth that not everything can be fixed, that there are things not because one does not want to, but because one cannot. For a man who had spent his whole life controlling, understanding, interpreting, facing things that could not be controlled, could not be explained, was a challenge no less profound. He may have wondered, in the most private moments, whether things could have been different, whether there were choices that, if changed, the outcome would not be as it is now. But those questions, no matter how many times they appeared, could not change the reality that time only moves in one direction, and what has happened cannot be rewritten. What makes this truth harder to accept is that it exists alongside success, that a person can reach the peak in one field, be recognized, be honored, but still carry unfinished parts in their personal life. And there is no direct connection between the two. No rule that guarantees success in one place will bring completeness in another. That is a truth the world does not like to talk about, because it breaks the simple story of victory and reward, of overcoming difficulties leading to a happy ending. But real life is much more complicated, and sometimes the greatest people are also those who carry wounds that never fully heal. Anthony Hopkins is not a story of perfection, not a journey where everything is finally resolved, but a life where light and darkness exist together, where success does not erase losses, and where acceptance becomes an important part of continuing to live. In the silence of what cannot be changed, in accepting that there is no perfect ending, there exists a form of truth that few dare to face, that greatness does not mean completeness, that a person can be known to the whole world but still carry parts that no one truly understands, and perhaps it is there, in that imperfection, that his story becomes closer, more real, not like a distant legend, but like a human being who has been through so much, has achieved so much, but still has to learn to live with things he can never fully repair. And then, when every story gradually reaches the point where people expect a clear closure, a complete explanation, Anthony Hopkins' life chose a different direction. Not a perfect victory, not a full redemption, but a continuation, a persistent existence amid everything that had happened. He did not win everything because there were things in his life that were never fully resolved. There were relationships that did not return. There were voids that remained even though a long time had passed. And he was not perfect, not a model of a person without mistakes, not a story where every detail led to a beautiful ending. But the important thing was not whether he achieved perfection or not, but that he did not disappear in the years left behind, did not disappear in the self-destructive vortex of alcohol, did not disappear in the loneliness he had carried through many stages of his life. He stayed, in the quietest way, without needing to prove anything to anyone, without needing to build a new image, simply continuing to live, continuing to move forward, continuing to work like a person who had understood that existence itself was sometimes a form of victory. Art was still there, not as a means to escape, like in the early years, but as a natural part of who he was, a way for him to continue connecting with the world in the way he understood best, through roles, through expressions, through silences that he could fill with his own truth. Each role in this later stage was no longer an effort to prove, but a continuation of a long journey where he carried everything he had been through without hiding it, without blurring it, but letting it be present in the smallest details, like a form of honesty that only those who have gone through much loss can achieve. He might not have fixed everything, might not have been able to go back to change what had passed, but he could still create, could still contribute, could still leave marks without needing to be perfect. The loneliness he once carried did not disappear completely. It was not something that could be erased, but it no longer controlled him as before, no longer defined his entire being, but became a part of the story, a part that he had learned to live with, not fighting against it, not denying it, but accepting it. And in that acceptance there was a form of peace that was not loud, did not need recognition, simply the ability to exist without needing to run away from himself. When looking back at the entire journey, from a boy who once believed he had no value, to a man known to the whole world, what stood out the most was not the awards, not the roles, but the fact that he had gone through all those stages without completely losing himself, even though he had come very close to it many times. He was not a story about a person who won everything, but a story about a person who did not completely collapse. A person who had stood still, even when it seemed impossible to continue many times, and that, in its simplicity, carried a weight that did not need to be shown off. In a world that often only tells about clear victories, perfect endings, Anthony Hopkins' story reminds of something else, that there are people who do not need to fix everything to become meaningful, that there are lives that are not complete but still deserve to be honored, not because they are perfect, but because they are true. And perhaps, in the end, what he left behind was not only the roles or the awards, but the image of a man who had survived through his own silence, who had faced the parts that many avoid, and who had chosen to stay, not as an untouchable legend, but as a human being with everything that meant. The story of Anthony Hopkins leaves a feeling that is both heartbreaking and admiring because he is not a model of a complete life, but proof that a person can reach the peak while still carrying voids that are never filled. From a boy with dyslexia who was considered not good enough, sitting lost in class without understanding anything, to a man who woke up in panic because he did not remember what he had done after nights sunk in alcohol, he had gone through stages where many people might have completely collapsed. The moment he decided to quit alcohol alone, with no witnesses, no announcement, was exactly the point that showed his real strength, not on screen, but in real life. But what makes the story the most painful lies in what he could not hold on to. The relationship with his daughter gradually faded in silence, not because of a big event, but because of accumulated absences over the years. Even when he reached the peak with The Silence of the Lambs, or later with The Father, where he portrayed the fear of losing memory to an haunting degree, that success still could not repair the cracks in his personal life. That is the big lesson for American society, where individual success is often placed first, that career, money, or fame cannot replace presence in real relationships. Anthony Hopkins' life reminds us that the greatest victory is not being recognized by the whole world, but not losing oneself and the important people while pursuing that. Because there are losses that can never be retrieved, even if you have achieved everything. If Anthony Hopkins' story makes you reflect, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way to appreciate a man who did not collapse in front of his own darkness. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore the imperfect but meaningful stories of life.